Yeah.
Hello everyone. Just a second so I can share my screen. I can see myself. Okay, so I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for putting in so much amazing work. My number of slides is proportional to my enthusiasm for this subject, so try to give only a brief overview, the big picture, if you will, of how mental state talk and acquisition of mental terms um, tap into the development of theory of mind skills. This is working. Just a second. I think my screen froze. Yeah,
You're in full screen?
yeah, I don't.
Let's
Okay, now it works, I think.
yeah.
Yeah.
Let's try.
So,
Okay.
okay, sorry, some technical difficulties. In my talk, I'll try to answer a few questions about the development of mental state reasoning. Is it asynchronous or not? If there is a universal onset of false belief understanding, and if there is a cultural variance in theory of mind development, and um, lastly, I'll try to develop on the subject of either large language models, if they can acquire theory of mind or something akin to theory of mind. We all know by now that children pass a false belief task at around the same age, of around 4 or 5 years of age. And I try to look at what is behind of this seemingly universal onset and answer if this onset, if this theory of mind is immune to cultural variance or is it immune to environmental factors. Callahan and collaborators try to give an answer to this question through the 2005 cross-cultural study where they tested children from 5 different cultures, both Western and non-Western. And their conclusion was that by and large, children pass the false belief task at around the same time point. We have a meta-analysis that supports this conclusion on 500 studies on false belief understanding across Western and non-Western countries. This result was somewhat surprising due to their inclusion of Samoan children, and voices from the scientific community argued that the socialization practices of the Samoan children would reflect the differential acquisition of theory of mind skills. On one hand, the extensive social interaction and emphasis on adherence to social norms and obligations would determine an accelerated development, and on the other hand, the lack of personality and self-related vocabulary items, and the lack of expansions in the caregiver's speech would account for delayed acquisition, and some of them even argued that they might acquire these skills through different methods. And to answer this question and cast a shadow of doubt over Callahan's findings, Meyer tried to replicate the false belief task in Samoa, this time with a better, uh, uh, yeah, better methodology and better statistical measures. And they also use a modified translation in one of them, but that didn't ultimately affect the results. And their findings suggested a differential developmental trajectory. Some children only pass the false belief task better than chance at around 7 or 8 years of age. And at around 12 to 14 years of age, one third of them still fail to give the right answer to this task. Okay. One important observation that was made by Lillard about this issue is that I'll quote him. So, okay. Although in many cultures people refuse to talk about others' minds, this does not necessarily mean that people in those cultures never think about others' minds. I argue that maybe some children don't have the right necessary tools because they don't have the necessary language, mentalistic language. But we can also draw another conclusion that social interaction by itself is not a predictor of theory of mind development, and you also need something more, such as complementary linguistic input that is usually provided by the caregivers. This argument is also made by Villiers, and she extensively studied theory of mind throughout her academic lifetime, and she argues that through expansions, caregivers ascribe intentionality to their child's utterances or behaviors, and then later interpret the inner worlds by providing labels for those private events. So I suppose they kind of adopt a theoretical stance, but again, this is debatable. In other words, they provide the repertoire of words, or as I said before, the necessary tools. And later they, by taking part in conversations where um, different views and opinions are shared on the same subject, this will act as a catalyst in the child's understanding of different perspectives and will lead to a ceiling level theory of mind. But again, I don't think that's the best wording. Maybe a better development, we can say. Okay, another interesting observation that was also made by Villiers that these mentalistic words also allow two different interpretations. One that is with respect to the state of affairs in the world, and one with respect to the individual's mental world. So this dichotomy that these words allow may help the sudden I don't know, realization that children have that maybe their mental world is different than the others' mental world. Okay. This claim is also supported by by the literature with extensive studies done on different language interventions. This is one that employed thought bubbles in a sample of deaf children of hearing and non-native signer parents. They account this delayed acquisition of theory of mind due to their caregivers' non-fluent and lack of understanding of mental state terms. So they did not provide that linguistic input that is necessary. And their conclusions are quite interesting. Not only did they get accustomed to operate on that single theory of mind task, they also generalized their knowledge. So they were simply conditioned to deliver a certain answer. Of course, to have some criticism of this claim, one would be that if there was a critical period of theory of mind acquisition, similar to Leonardsburg's model that was supposedly linked to brain maturation, then this claim would be kind of refuted. We know from a study that was done on Nicaraguan Sign Language that was conducted in 2009 they tested two cohorts, one that naturally developed a nascent form of the Nicaraguan Sign Language with uh, a bigger mean age of 27, and another cohort that expanded that language with their mean age was around 17, and they concluded that the first group produced less mental state talk signs related to mental state terms, and failed the false belief task well into adulthood. When they tested the same conditions 2 years later, there were no significant differences between the two cohorts in terms of mental state production and false belief understanding, and they provide this explanation that the narrowing of the ability gap between the two cohorts was happened as a result of a richer linguistic interaction between the older group with the younger group, and this interaction where mental state terms where the younger counterparts shared richer linguistic interactions in terms of mental states. So we can draw two conclusions that as they said, language and false belief understanding develop hand in hand. We cannot have one without the other. And there is not any biological mechanism that is associated with theory of mind acquisition, and this doesn't flow that much into adulthood. Another piece of criticism is that if a language is so important, then why do infants pass this false belief task? There are plenty of studies done on this. For example, this is a 2010 study that was done on second year 2-year-olds. And their claim was that infants acquire false belief understanding much earlier than we thought. And this might be some kind of innate system or I don't know, part of the core knowledge. And rather, its development is constrained by executive functioning skills. That was their claim. And to be completely honest, that is a pretty good claim. Villiers, the psycholinguist that I've mentioned earlier, provides a counter argument and says that rather what is tested in this non-linguistic task is an understanding of intentionality or directional movement, or as she put it, intentional directional movement is blind. That is, the infant does not have an understanding of what object the watcher expects to be in that location. What intentions have direction but lack content, whereas beliefs have content. This is their explanation, and I agree that I don't think they have in um, mental representation in terms of content. But if you go back to their claim that false belief understanding is constrained by poor executive functioning skills, I do agree with them. This is a meta-analysis that was done I think my screen.
No, he's still online. But
Okay.
you
Well,
can just
I think good. This should work. Okay. So continuing, due to this training on better executive function, bilingual children pass this task a bit earlier, but not significant. So their claim that executive functioning comes into play is sound. However, there are some I know this conclusion that mental state terms act as some sort of scaffolding system of sorts, or a common reference point in for mental state attribution is quite lackluster and obvious. However, now that we've got this laid down, I think the fun can begin. We have some philosophers that argue that in our quest to sense making, we don't rely on false belief attribution and mental state attribution at all. They propose some sort of deviation from the um, Gopnik's child scientist approach to Vygotsky cultural historical child approach, and they argue that rather we read the embodied mind and not the read mental. We do not really read mental states. One of these theoretical frameworks is Magir's regulative conception of folk psychology, that entails we explain behavior through social norms and protocols, or in other words, we contextualize behavior by inferring what is socially acceptable or expected from for a person of said social rank to do or to say. This, although radical, this would somehow provide a plausible decoding framework for the opacity of mind doctrine in Samoa. However, I think that a more comprehensive approach is Hutto's narrative practice hypothesis. And similarly to the previous one, this he also refutes mind reading as the sole interpretative ability that children acquire. However, he puts emphasis on the child's engagement in narrative practices, for example, storytelling about people's actions. Um, and according to the NPH, such narratives are held accountable for shaping, contextualizing theory of mind competencies. And uh, he also proposes that theory of mind involves the combinatorial ability to generalize formal narratives that are internalized by the children and produce a newer one that is appropriate to that particular context and situation. And it's important to restate this without assuming mental states. So again, this is we explain behavior that is socially embedded in some cultural or social norms. I agree that we also use narratives to explain behavior, but I don't think this approach is sufficient at all. As Villiers pointed out, we still heavily rely on ascribing mental states when sense making. And another argument is that what happens when we don't have an available or acceptable narrative to retrieve for a particular behavior, to explain a particular behavior. So, although very insightful, this is not sufficient. Therefore, this is the novel part of my talk. I propose a sort of dual process theory for theory of mind, and also I draw my inspiration from Kahneman System 1, System 2 paradigm. So I propose that theory of mind is rather, or maybe even folk psychology, we can define it as as the conjunction of a system one that is responsible for narrative retrieval and a system two that is governed by mental state attribution. To take it step by step, I put forward that system one is more superficial structure and is responsible with sense making only in terms of reason. So that would be the Hutto's narrative or narrative competence. let's say, and the availability and representative heuristics are also quite important because they kind of govern what narrative we retrieve in that moment. Then system one, this deviation from system one and system two is mediated by a feeling of rightness that was postulated by Thomson. I will not go that much into detail because that would be beyond the scope of my talk. And the system two employs other accounts of theory of mind, such as theory, simulation theory, to ascribe mental states when a narrative is not retrievable, or I think we can also refine that initial narrative by employing theory of simulation theory. Um, for example, if someone, I don't know, has some medical issues and, I don't know, has kidney stones, we can retrieve a narrative that we've once been told that people who suffer from kidney stones have back pain, but if we also had a similar medical condition, we can maybe simulate the way they feel and later refine that first narrative that we've internalized. I'll try also to give some future. I won't have the time to answer this question, obviously, but I'll try to provide some future tracks of investigation of whether large language models can acquire theory of mind or something akin to theory of mind, and I'll base these answers on my previous model of folk psychology. I propose that theory of mind can acquire due to their programming with probabilistic nets. They have something similar to our high generalizability of events. So uh, there would be something to our narrative or representative heuristics. And again, some exposure to different narratives would lead to a refining of sense making. However, it lacks subjective experience, semantic understanding, embodied cognition, so no simulation theory or even theory counts to theory of mind. And it also lacks short-term memory. So we wouldn't have availability heuristics. So when large language model would retrieve a narrative, large language model would act on solely on representative heuristics and not on availability heuristics. However, for example, Hagendorf we see something like an external short-term memory. So maybe in the future we would have some availability heuristics as well from large language models. That would be all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raresh. We can start. Wait, no. So first of all, does anyone have any questions in the room or online?
I just,
Yeah.
if anyone else has other questions, if not, I'll just abuse my power.
Please.
So, you saw this, variations, right, in the, false belief test results, right? Why do you think, this happens and how does this bear on the concept that we have about theory of mind? Do you think that this bears on any specific, family of theories? And then I'd like to go back to your, slides with the system one and system two.
Okay.
Right, so you're saying here that system one would be some sort of narrative retrieval, but this is not necessarily built upon a Hurow's approach, right? Because he would be he would talk about it in a radical and activist view, right? So you don't need a presentation for that, right? It would be something that's co-created and enacted within the environment. But then you're saying in system two, both could work, right? So you're saying that theory and simulation theory. But you know, these two have their own
Yeah.
incompatibility, right? So are you, what were you thinking about? It's like some sort of a hybrid, and how did you think about the two working together?
Okay. To answer your first question about the variance in development, I think false belief understanding, because you have to make this distinction between theory of mind and false belief understanding. False belief understanding may be a part of theory of mind, as I propose. This development of false belief understanding is dependent upon mental state talk and this acquisition of mental state terms in caregiver-child dyads, or so why this doesn't mean that they don't understand that maybe the other mind thinks differently, but the way this false belief task is constructed won't allow that, for example, some children to actually show their understanding of the other's mind. So basically, I think that the false belief task is a bit flawed in this regard. But I think that false belief understanding should develop uniformly as long as mental state talk is present and in a significant quantity and quality. And the other question was how theory and simulation theory would coexist.
Plural is ideal here, right? You have in system one some narrative retrieval, which should somehow be based on some sort of narrative practice hypothesis, but you would have to redefine it if not coming or stemming from an inactivist account, right? And then you would need that to be compatible with both theory and simulation theory, right? But in theory, it means that ascribing mental states to other is based on applying some sort of theory, right? But then if you're saying that in system one it works with narrative retrieval, why would it not work with theory retrieval, right? So then if you're saying that simulation theory would work, then you're saying that you can just imagine, right? And then you can, as a result of your imagining of what the other person might be feeling, right? You're just going to ascribe that result to said person. So, right, the two are not necessarily compatible, but I can see a hybrid form.
Okay.
There's a lot of hybrid forms in the literature between TT and SC. But what were your thoughts?
Yeah,
What did you
I try to see this narrative retrieval as solely social culturally embedded, so that wouldn't be personalized, related to the individual. So that would be like the first thing that pops up in your head, that following my example, there should be some kind of pain that person feels, only because they were told sometime in the past that this person should feel pain. And only the system two is this refining in terms of the individual's understanding of the individual's mental, not really mental world, but something like that. Yeah, I think there could be a hybrid model that would employ both theory and simulation theory, but I know this. I'm not sure which one I should have picked, because
So the way I get it, right? If you have some norms already available to you about, that people act for reasons, these are the available norms and so on, you're just going to use that. But then if something goes wrong and you're in an awkward social situation, then you're going to come up with some sort of theory about what's going on, right? So what are you going to use? Because it depends. If you just if you say that you're gonna start imagining what other people are feeling, or then start simulating, then you should go with simulation theory. If you're saying that you come up with a theory via TT, then you're gonna have to
not
say
sure
that.
if the way I see it, I don't think they're mutually totally mutually exclusive, right? I think there could be some sort of hybrid model that uses some parts and components of both, but I agree, I see your point.
Okay, so could a large language model acquire any of this?
A system 2 or a system
Well, they can get narratives that are already available, so they have access to that. Yeah, the problem is that system 2.
No,
Do you see
it
any possibility?
won't. At least as of now, it won't, because either they heavily rely on short-term memory and embodied cognition. So I don't think so.
But what if you take a large language model and then put it in some sort of a robotic exoskeleton thingy? Then it would be situated.
Yeah.
I'll stop here.
Yeah.
There's another question from Michael, I think, and I saw another one, but lost.
Okay. Hello, Raresh. Thanks for your talk. And I also had some concerns. I mean, some points that were puzzling for me in using System 1 and System 2 from Kahnemans to adapt them to the narrative practice hypothesis. And my concern is that it doesn't seem that the narrative competencies are the kind of things that feel well in System 1 category. System 1s are systems that are quick, they process the superficial input, but the narrative competence is exactly the opposite of that. It's a holistic capacity to reason about situation and to make up reasons for actions by putting yourself in a verbal conversation and so it doesn't seem to me that the narrative retrieval capacity can really fill in the box of System 1 at the opposite. And related with this is that Hatto's point is that we don't need to use mentalistic capacities most of the time. We just use them in very particular cases. So why instead the assumptions of the theory here in simulation theory is that we usually use mind reading as a predictive capacity. Why instead the idea of the narrative competence is that we only make up narratives when they are required just to fix wrong cases. And in that case, we already find mental states in the narratives because this is the landscape of consciousness. Hatto refers to Acts of Meaning, the book by 1990. So yeah, my concern is that if we can use narrative competence to fill in the box of this System 1, I don't think that's very easy to do because the two characteristics, they go in different directions. And second, that the point of Hatto's idea of that mind reading is not a theory here, a simulation theory, but it's a narrative competence. It is also that the range of applications where you apply mind reading is very limited. It's not that wide as theory theories and simulation theories would claim. So I had in mind these 2 points that when I see slides 20, they made me kind of be concerned about your proposal. If you can elaborate on this, or I hope this can provide you food for thought, let's say.
Well, the way I saw it, thank you for the question, first of all. The way I saw it was, this is rather a very brief analogy. So I know it's not that accurate. I suppose that System 1 requires less effort. So again, this is my view that narrative retrieval doesn't require that much deliberate functioning, while System 2 does. This is based on my understanding of, and my friends' understanding too, when they ascribe mental states to others, that would be a not really a conscious effort, but that would be a more effortful rather than just explaining a behavior only through narratives. Yeah, that would be. This is not a complete overlap with the System 1, System 2 paradigm, but I only borrowed the effort that each system requires. The way I see it is that narrative retrieval would be much easier to use in a day-to-day situation, or in special when mental state attribution requires some sort of requires more resources and energy rather than System 1, which is is faster and is not that effortful. I agree that this is not the best analogy and overlap, but I try to give some insight into how large language models we could view theory of mind in large language models. That would be why is this analogy?
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? If not, thank you again, Raresh. Amazing presentation. We can stop the recording.
3 minutes.